Can you imagine watching someone you love grow weaker, listening for footsteps that never came, waiting and then losing him? Hi friends, welcome back to Stories of Faith and Grace podcast. If you were with us in the last episode, you remember the story of Job, a man who lost everything and yet refused to let go of God. A man who asked hard questions, wept real tears, and still whispered, "Though he slay me, yet I will hope in him." Today, we're continuing and closing our More Than a Conqueror series. And if Job's story was about trusting God in the silence, today's stories are about trusting Him in the waiting. The kind of waiting where time feels like it's working against you, where every passing moment isn't just uncomfortable, it's costly. Today, we're going to sit with two families. A father whose daughter stopped breathing while he was still on his way back with Jesus. And a family whose brother had already been in the grave 4 days by the time Jesus arrived. So, two stories, two desperate waits, one God who is never late. Not once, not ever late. Let's begin. It was the kind of day that starts with crowds. Jesus had just stepped off a boat, and before he could even take a few steps, people were already pressing in from every side. The kind of crowd where everyone is carrying something urgent, a sickness, a question, a last remaining hope. And somewhere in that crowd was a man named Jairus. He wasn't an ordinary man. He was a ruler of the synagogue, respected, visible, a man with reputation and responsibility. And he fell at Jesus' feet, not stood, not waited patiently. He fell. "My daughter," he said, "she's dying. But if you come, if you lay your hand on her, she will live." And for a moment, everything else faded, because when it's your child, nothing else matters. Not status, not opinion, not pride. Desperation has a way of stripping everything back until all that's left is what truly matters. And Jesus went with him. But on the way, while every second mattered, Jesus stopped. A woman in the crowd had reached out and touched his garment. For 12 years, she had been bleeding. 12 years of isolation, of being overlooked, of trying everything and finding no relief. And in one moment of quiet, desperate faith, she reached out and she was healed. Jesus stopped. He found her. He spoke to her gently. It was a beautiful moment. But if you were Jairus, standing there, watching time slip away, for Jairus, this may not have felt beautiful, because every second mattered. And every second Jesus paused was a second his daughter didn't have. And then the moment he feared most arrived. Someone came from his house. "You don't need to trouble him anymore," they said. "Your daughter is gone." Just like that. Hope, as Jairus understood it, ended. But Jesus turned to him right there. In the middle of that moment, he said, "Don't be afraid, only believe." 5 words, because now Jairus wasn't just being asked to believe for healing. He was being asked to trust beyond death itself. And quietly, without protest, without recorded resistance, he kept walking. He walked with Jesus toward a house that had already begun to grieve. When they arrived, the mourning had already started. Voices were raised. Grief had filled the space. And Jesus said something that sounded almost impossible. "She's not dead, but sleeping." You know, they laughed, not gently, but with the kind of certainty that comes from believing the situation is beyond hope. But Jesus puts them outside. He went in with the child's parents and a few close disciples. He took her by the hand. "Little girl, arise." And she did. She stood up. She walked. Life returned. In the middle of that miracle, Jesus said something so simple, almost feels surprising. Gave her something to eat, because even in the extraordinary, he cared about the ordinary. I want you to sit with this for a moment. Jairus came to Jesus in faith. Jesus said yes, and then everything seemed to go wrong anyway. There was a delay, there was an interruption, and then there was the worst possible news. And yet, he kept walking. That is the invitation in Jairus' story. Not to pretend the fear isn't real, not to force yourself into calm, but to keep walking with Jesus, even when the news has already arrived, even when it feels like there's nothing left to hope for. Do not be afraid, only believe. Now hold on to that. We're going to need it, because there is another family, another message sent, another wait that felt too long. But this time, it didn't just seem like Jesus was late. This time, Jesus delayed. There was a man named Lazarus. He was loved deeply. And when he became sick, his sister sent word to Jesus, "The one you love is ill." They didn't beg. They didn't explain. They simply told him, because when you know you are loved, you trust that he will come. But he didn't. Not right away. He stayed where he was for 2 more days. Not because he didn't care, not because he wasn't aware, but somehow the delay was part of the story. And it's important to understand something here. When Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, he wasn't confused. He wasn't unaware. He said quietly to those around him, "This sickness will not end in death. It will reveal the glory of God." He knew where the story was going, even while everyone else was still watching it unfold in real time. And still, he stayed 2 more days. Not because he didn't love them. In fact, we are told clearly that he loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus deeply. So the delay was not distance, it was intentional. And when he finally turned to his disciples and said, "Let's go back," they were confused, concerned even, because the last time they had been there, people had tried to harm him. It didn't feel safe. It didn't feel wise to go back there. But Jesus spoke in a way they didn't fully understand at the time, about walking in the light, about moving with purpose, about not stumbling when you are where you're meant to be. I'm sure they didn't still understand all of that. And then he said something that sounded gentle, but carried more weight than they realized. "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going to wake him." They didn't understand. They thought he meant rest, maybe recovery, so he said it plainly. Lazarus is dead. What was about to happen would take their faith somewhere it had never been before. And one of them, Thomas, quietly said to the others, "Let's go too, that we may die with him." Even in that moment, they still didn't see the full picture. But while all of this was unfolding, there was a house in Bethany still waiting. Now, can you imagine that house, watching someone you love grow weaker, listening for footsteps that never came, waiting and then losing him? By the time Jesus arrived, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. Not recent, not uncertain, it was final. Now, Martha went out to meet him. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." It wasn't accusation, it was grief. Speaking honestly, Jesus met her there, not with explanation first, but with revelation. "I am the resurrection and the life," not just what he does, but who he is. Then Mary came, she fell at his feet, undone, grieving, and said the same words. And Jesus saw her. He saw her tears. He saw the weight of the moment, and he was deeply moved, and then he wept. wept. Even knowing what he was about to do, he still wept because their pain was real, because love does not stand unmoved in the face of loss. They stood before the tomb. "Take away the stone," Jesus said. And even then, there was hesitation because reality, as they understood it, had already settled in. But the stone was moved, and Jesus called out, "Lazarus, come out." And the man who had been dead walked out, still wrapped, still bound, but alive. And Jesus said, "Unbind him and let him go." Jesus could have prevented Lazarus' death, but he didn't. And as for those waiting, it must have felt like absence. But the delay was not indifference. The delay was purpose. Because what he was doing required more than healing. It required resurrection. And resurrection comes after what feels like the end. Now, step back with me for a moment, because across these two episodes, we've now walked through three very different kinds of impossible. Three people. We walked with Job, who lost everything, who sat in silence that stretched across chapters and seasons, who never received an explanation but received something more, an encounter, a knowing, a faith refined past the point of comfort and into something unbreakable. His was the suffering of unanswered questions. Then we walked with Jairus, who came to Jesus in faith, who experienced delay and interruption and the arrival of the very news he feared most, who was also to keep walking and keep believing even after the worst had already happened. His was the suffering of God seeming late. And then we walked with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, where Jesus was not just late by circumstance, but delayed by intention, where the miracle was not healing but resurrection, where the glory of God was only visible on the other side of what looked like the end. Theirs was the suffering of God, allowing finality so that he could rewrite it entirely. Three stories, three families, three kinds of waiting, and in every single one, the same God. Present in silence, present in the delay, present at the tomb. This is what it means to be more than a conqueror. You know, not that we never suffer, not that the news never comes, not that we never sit in ashes or stand at a graveside, but that we are people who have met a God who is sovereign over every one of those moments and who remains when we cannot see him working. Jairus showed us he is never late. Keep walking. Lazarus shows us he is not absent. He is preparing something resurrection-sized. Job showed us he may not explain, but he will show up and the encounter will change you. Do not be afraid, only believe. I am the resurrection and the life. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. Three declarations, three people who had every reason to let go, and yet, even in their grief and uncertainty, chose to hold on. That is the posture of the more than a conqueror. Thank you for being in this space today. If this series has blessed you, if you are in a Jairus season where you are still walking toward the house, even though the news has arrived, or a Lazarus season where the stone has already been rolled and 4 days have already passed, I want you to know you are not forgotten. You are not outside the reach of the God who weeps with you and still commands the dead to live. Hold on, keep walking, let him be exactly who he has always been. If the stories have stirred something in you, please share this episode with someone who needs it. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next on Stories of Faith and Grace podcast. Until next time, grace and peace. He is not finished yet. Take care.